It is August. Quite a bit into August. It's August 7th, so it's time to do my July reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I talk about all the books that I've read throughout the prior month. But you can also see my thoughts on all these books in my weekly updates, because I currently do a vlog every week where I talk about the books closer to the time that I've read them so that I can discuss them a little bit more in depth. This is more of just a quick wrap-up of everything I've read. The first book that I finished in July was The Tea Dragon Society by Kate O'Neill. I think they go by K. O'Neill now, and I believe that this is a non-binary author. The Tea Dragon Society is a very cute, short, little graphic novel. I love the colors. I love the illustrations, and there are 3 graphic novels in the Tea Dragon Society series so far. I don't know if there's going to be more. I know that this is the original trilogy. The Tea Dragon Society is about a young girl whose parents are blacksmiths, and she is apprenticing with her parents. But one day she discovers a lost tea dragon, which is a little dragon that sprouts tea out of their head. She returns the dragon to its owner, discovers the world of tea dragons, and the tea dragon master asks if she would also apprentice. So this is her finding out about tea dragons. It's her finding out about that whole world, and then also all the people in it. So the tea dragon master and his husband, as well as some other people in their circle. It's very cute. It's very sweet. It has a lot of representation, queer representation, disability representation, and other things. And I really loved it. And I'm so happy that I found it at my local used bookstore, and I definitely hope that I find more. The next book that I finished in July was Black Girl Call Home, which are poems by Jasmine Mans. I know I compare a lot of poetry to Rupi Kaur, but this felt very much like Rupi Kaur. There's a lot of very short poetry in this. One stanza, a few lines, one line in some instances, and it is about being a young Black woman, a young woman of color in today's society. Jasmine Mans is a Black woman from New Jersey, so her perspective is obviously going to be different than Rupi Kaur, who is a Indian woman living in Canada. And these were written at very different times, you know, multiple years after Rupi Kaur, and these people all have different experiences, but there are some universal truths of experience of young women and young people of color in society today, and those kind of hold true. I liked this collection quite a bit. I like the pop culture and political references that Man includes. I like the New Jersey references a little bit that are in here. But I did think that this collection was too long. Like, I like collections that are like more short and more curated to be what they're about. I find the same problem even if they're short, but they're just gathered together from various other places. Like, I like a collection to be shorter, to have a little bit more of a point. I did feel like this was a little bit young for me. And obviously out of my own experience, the same way that Rupi Kaur is, because I am not the target age and I am not a woman of color. So the experiences are very different, but I think that that is very beneficial to read from, and I will continue to read Jasmine Mans' poetry or anything else that they write once I find it. I did connect with some of the poetry in here, being a woman, having been a young woman, being from New Jersey, being queer, because Jasmine Mans is also a queer author. The next book that I finished in July was Caught in the Quiet by Rod McKuen. This is another collection of poetry. This is another queer author, but Rod McKuen was writing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was also a songwriter and a musician. I don't know if he played music, but he was like a singer, but he also wrote for other artists. And Caught in the Quiet is a poetry collection about the quiet moments in between relationships, like between the actual relationships when you break up with someone to the next, relationship, but also when you are with someone and there are quiet moments, whether that's for good or bad, when you are alone and hoping for a relationship. And I just thought it was a really good and interesting collection of poetry. A lot of things that did resonate me with. I tabbed quite a bit at the bottom. You can see, like, I didn't tab that much on Black Girl Call Home. I tabbed a lot more on this. So there were lines that I thought were really beautiful, or that I felt connected to, or there were imagery or ideas that I related to or wanted to revisit. And I thought this was really sweet. I also love the cover, and I've collected a lot of Rod McKuen based on the covers of his book, so I'm happy to have finally read one, and I will continue reading his work. The next book that I finished in July, I started in June, and this is Horse Barbie by Gina Rocero. This is a memoir about Gina, who grew up in the Philippines as a very effeminate child, and then realized that she was actually a girl, and how her family reacted to that, which was surprisingly well, because there is a large trans population in the Philippines. Despite it being taboo in some ways, it's also revered in some ways, and partly that has to do with kind of ancient Filipino culture. Also, that there is a strong trans pageant culture in the Philippines as well. Gina gets involved in trans pageantry and becomes a pageant queen. And then, since her mother has moved to America, she decides to move to America so that she can get better gender-affirming care. Gina talks a lot about how in the Philippines, because of Catholicism, because of politics, it's very hard to be trans, it's very hard to be queer in a lot of ways, but how also there is space made for queer and trans people in that culture, and how she thought that she was going to get a lot more respect and get a lot more acceptance in America because they have things like gender affirming care, because they have things like that you can change your gender marker on your identification and things like that. But when she gets to America, she finds out that it's just as dangerous, it's just as hard, there's just as many pitfalls that she could get into, just as many dangerous situations that she gets into as there were in her home country, and she has to learn like a whole new way to navigate that. But she does eventually get that gender affirming care that she needs, and she talks about how the whole time before and during those circumstances she had to hide her transness a lot, and how at a pivotal point in her life she decides that she needs to come out and advocate for trans women. Instead of wanting to be a cis woman or pretending to be a cis woman, she has to embrace her trans womanness and help other trans people create space for them in the world in which she lives. So it was really an interesting memoir. I do think it was a little rose-tinted, and the bad things that probably did happen to Gina, I think she was very lucky, but there probably were those things that weren't mentioned or were mentioned very briefly, which I find happens a lot in memoirs like this. Like, I think the author just doesn't want that to be the point of the memoir. I felt the same way about Pamela Anderson's memoir. Even though she talks about being sexually assaulted, she doesn't want that to be the point of her memoir. She has so much more in her life that she wants to explain, and Gina, I think, felt the same way. And Gina obviously has the added importance that she sees of relaying her trans story in a relatable way. So I did really enjoy this. I'm super happy to have read it. I just always suggest reading memoirs from people who experience that experience if you're interested in what their lives might be like. I mean, I know that sounds like a very silly thing to say, but if you're interested in what a woman's life might be like, you know, read a memoir by a woman. If you are interested in what a trans person's life might be like, read a memoir from a trans person. It gives you a totally different perspective, and obviously no one category of person is a monolith, so read many and you will get many different perspectives, and you will be able to have a glimpse at someone else's experience. That's why I love memoirs. The next book that I finished in July was What to the Slave is the 4th of July by Fredrick Douglass. This speech was told on July 5th, 1852, and this is a speech that he gave to a women's auxiliary, I believe, in New England about the topic of what to the slave is the 4th of July. And this essay is that speech, and it was perfect to read. I read it on July 5th, 2026, and it is a scathing rebuke of the United States and the idea of the 4th of July and how ludicrous it was in 1852, and it definitely resonated with me how ludicrous it was in 2026 to be celebrating something that is kind of a sham and not at all what it was intended. If you thought that the 4th of July was a time to celebrate freedom and a time to celebrate the lack of oppression by England, our freedom from England as the United States, then you're doing it wrong, because there are a lot of people who are not free in this country, and there are a lot of people who are still oppressed, and there is a lot of systemic racism, homophobia, misogynistic tendencies, and various other things that we still need to work on. And I think Fredrick Douglass did a very good job of explaining that, as he was known to do. He was also very well known for being a escaped slave, a slave that freed himself. He was an enslaved man who taught himself how to read and write. He was an enslaved man who sought freedom at all costs and any costs, and did eventually gain that freedom and became an abolitionist, and talked to many abolitionist groups and other people about the true nature of slavery and the true realities of slavery, and he does so in this essay as well. So I definitely highly recommend it. I read it on audio. It was very quick, and it was great read, especially at the time that I read it. The next book that I finished in July was Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This is like the 5th or the 6th Riley Sager that I've read. This is the 3rd that he wrote in publication order, and it's definitely a little dated. I think it was from 2017, maybe 2019, and I feel like this is a story that now we've seen a lot of times. The main character is a young woman, Jules, who lost her sister. Her sister went missing and was never found when she was a teenager, and this irreparably damaged her family and her relationship with her family and their lives going forward. And then later, when Jules is in college and her parents unexpectedly pass away, she finds that she now not only is an only child, but she's an orphan as well. She follows her best friend to New York, but we find out in the very beginning of this book that she loses her job and her boyfriend and her place to live all in the same day, so Jules needs to go ahead and look for another job. She happens upon a want ad for a house sitter in a building that is very familiar to her. It is a building that she read about in a fictional book when she was a child that she and her sister loved, and she thinks it's a great opportunity to at least go and look at this apartment building that is a very well-known and well-renowned apartment building on the Upper West Side. Jules goes to the interview, and to her great surprise, it seems like a job that's too good to be true, and she gets the job, so she feels like she has to take it, and then the book goes from there. Obviously, this is a thriller, this is a mystery. We discover why Jules would be able to get this good job. We learn about Jules's past. Her name is Jules, right? Throughout this book, and if you know Riley Sager, there's going to be some twists and some turns and some interesting things that happen. I just didn't find this to be one of the more interesting Riley Sager books. I think that, like I said, I've read mysteries like this before, and it wasn't doing anything particularly amazing, and I didn't really love it. That being said, his books are infinitely readable, and they're easy to get through. They're very quick. They're fun. Don't go as cuckoo bananas as I like my mystery thrillers to go. That being said, I did enjoy it. The next book that I finished in July is What Kind of Woman by Kate Baer. This is Kate Baer's first collection of poetry. I read her second collection of poetry earlier this year, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but this is a little bit like Rupi Kaur, similar to how this one was, except if Rupi Kaur was in her 30s and she was a new mother. A lot of these poems have to do with motherhood, with womanhood, with coming of age into motherhood. I think you come of age many times, and discovering your identity is always coming of age, and your identity is always changing. Kate Baer was a young woman, now she's an older woman, now she's a mother, now she's a wife, so a lot of these are short poems that have to do with motherhood, with wifehood, and with current events. So she does talk a little bit about her history and a little bit about her childhood, but mostly she talks about her current day, and during that current day is the pandemic. So there is a little bit of pandemic poetry in here. I like Kate Baer's poetry. I like the way that she writes. I don't identify with a ton of her poems because we are very different people. Now again, like we might both be cis white women, but as far as I know, Kate Baer is not queer, and since she has children, that's an experience that I'm never going to have. So interesting to read about, but I don't necessarily identify with, I don't necessarily relate to, but I will continue to read Kate Baer's poetry. And if you're looking for something that is short, sweet, easy to read, not obscure poetry, but a little bit of an older take on Rupi Kaur, then I would highly recommend Kate Baer's work. The next book that I finished in July is The Clock House Murders by Yukito Ayatsuji. This is the 4th or 5th book in the House Murders series as they've been translated into English. These books were originally written in the 80s and 90s, I believe. They are more recently translated into English and republished here in the United States, and I think in England as well, although I think they get those first. The House Murders series follows Detective Shimada, who is an amateur detective, an amateur sleuth who loves mystery novels, especially Golden Age mystery novels, who trained to be a priest at one point in his life, and who is a little bit obsessed with a particular architect who creates these extraordinary houses all over Japan. The first in the series is the Decagon House Murders, and that sees a collection of mystery lovers going to the Decagon House, which is the most well-known of this architect's house because it was his house, and also because he died there under mysterious circumstances. So this mystery lovers group, who all call themselves by Golden Age mystery names, go to the house to stay at the Decagon House, which happens to be on an island, for a period of time to try and solve the mystery of the Decagon House. Shimada gets involved in all these mysteries somehow. He solves all these crimes. So the first in the series was the Decagon House Murders, the next was the Mill Murders, the next was the Labyrinth Murders, and then we have the Clock House Murders. And in the Clock House Murders, we see Shimada moving on. He actually has become an author now, as well as an amateur sleuth. And a friend of his who we've met in other books says that he's going to one of this architect's homes, this clock house, to stay with a psychic there overnight and to explore the house with a paranormal group. There's kind of an old wing and a new wing, and this group is going to go to the old wing and get locked in for several days with this psychic and try to see if there's paranormal activity, again, because of the mysterious deaths that have happened in the house and because of the clocks. All the house mysteries have interesting devices with the house. There's always some kind of mystery or intrigue or hidden aspects of the house. In this house, we have all the clocks that this man collected, and we learn the backstory of these houses. In the Clock House Murder, we learn the backstory of the owner of the house, whose wife and child died under mysterious circumstances, and who he himself died under mysterious circumstances. And we have this group of new people coming in, and why are these new people coming in? And we have Shimada, who shows up eventually. This was a really fun installment. I really enjoyed this mystery, and I love all these books so much, so I will continue to read them as they get translated and as they come out in America. I read these all on audio. I do find that the names connecting to the characters is hard for me reading these on audio. I wish I had the physical copies as well, because not only are they Japanese names, which sometimes are hard to distinguish as a Western reader, but there also is always a naming aspect in these books where people are called different things, where people have secret identities, where people have mistaken identities, and so it becomes like very hard to distinguish all their names sometimes. And this one definitely was one of the more confusing books in that respect for me, but I really did enjoy it, and I'm so glad to have read it. If you like Golden Age mysteries, this is not the Golden Age of Western mysteries like Agatha Christie, but it is the Golden Age of Japanese mysteries, which happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they borrow heavily from our more well-known Golden Age in the West. The next book that I finished in July is A Few Rules for Predicting the Future by Octavia E. Butler. This is another essay. This is an essay that Butler wrote for a magazine and then was later republished in this very beautiful hardcover edition. It has illustrations, which are awesome, but it is a very very short essay, and there's not a lot of meat to it. It boils down to Butler being asked a question at a seminar and her response to that question and how it's relevant today, how she predicted the future in some of her books like Parable of the Sower, and how now that we're seeing that future come true, like how did she do that? I thought this was an interesting essay. I thought it was a beautiful book. I'm glad to have it, but I think this is the kind of essay that you should probably just read online, like print out as a PDF like this one. And I don't think that the meat of this essay was as exciting as this republished version makes it seem. Worth reading, sure, but it's literally like a 10-minute read, and it's not worth the $15 that this book costs. Luckily, I found this one in a little free library, so I'm happy to keep it. The next book that I finished in July is The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka, and this was the winner of the Booker Prize a few years ago. This follows Maali Almeida after he has died and is in the underworld trying to figure out what's going on. So Maali Almeida was a photographer who captured images of political moments in Sri Lanka and in other places. He tried to depict the corruption and the violence and the death around him in a very removed way, and he worked with different political parties, he worked with different magazines, he worked with whoever wanted to pay him for these photographs. But his life was, fairly close to this violence and this political unrest. He had a love of his life, Dee Dee, and he had a platonic love of his life, and this book follows Maali through the underworld as he realizes that the way that he thought of his life and the person who he thought he was maybe was not as good or kind or respectful to himself or to people around him as he thought. He has a very specific idea of who he is, and throughout his journey in the underworld we see that kind of dismantled. But we also see that Maali has something that he needs to accomplish before he moves on from this kind of middle ground underworld. He has 7 moons to do it. He needs to manipulate the real world. He needs to manipulate the living to be able to move on. So I really loved this book. I thought it was really interesting. I read this one on audio. I thought the audio was totally great. I do think this was a little long. I think there's a lot of passages in this about Maali learning and us, the reader, learning about how the underworld worked that could have been cut. And there was quite a lot of underworld purgatory aspects that we did see that were very repetitive, that we didn't need to see over and over again. Like, you kind of got it right away. But I do think that that also had to do with the pacing of the book and the pacing of Maali's 7 moons in that purgatory state. This book reminded me a little bit of Mr. Loverman in that Maali and Barry, the main character of that book, are very similar in that they're not like the nicest people. They're not like the greatest guys, and they cheat on their boyfriends, their husbands. They are not super respectful to their wife type characters. Throughout the book, we see both these characters kind of having that realization. We, the reader, are wondering whether they can make amends, whether they can do better, whether they can change their ways, or in Maali's case, whether he can make that clear before he has to move on out of this purgatory state because he is dead. There's also a lot of mystery in this. There's also a lot of political intrigue. There's a lot of action in this. We get to meet Maali, his mother, his boyfriend slash husband, and his platonic love best friend. So I really loved it. I thought it was great. I can't wait to read more by this author. I love this cover too. Next, I finished Facing the River by Czesław Miłosz. This was translated from the Polish by the author and Robert Haas. Miłosz is a Lithuanian author, and he was forced to leave Lithuania. This collection is him after many, many years going back to Lithuania and seeing the landscape that he had left such a long time ago and revisiting places from his childhood and from his youth and facing the river. So there were a lot of really interesting poems in this about his homeland and about his youth, but mostly about looking back on youth and about him looking back on his life as an old man and being surprised that he even was able to go back and look at some of these things. There's a lot of literary references in in this. There's a poem to Allen Ginsberg. There's poetry about authors that he liked or stories that he liked. And in some of those, we get a longer explanation, so kind of an essay about the poem before we read the poem. And those were some of my favorite ones. I connected with quite a bit of this. I tabbed quite a bit at the bottom, and I thought a lot of it was really interesting. A lot of it I didn't connect with. There were a lot of very long poems, which I find it difficult to read sometimes, but overall I thought it was a great poetry collection. I'm glad to have read it, and I will definitely be reading more from this author. The next book that I finished in July is The White Guy Dies First, 13 Scary Stories of Fear and Power. This was edited by Terry J. Benton Walker, and we do have an essay by Walker in here. I mean, an essay. We do have a short story by Walker in here, as well as short stories from people like Farida Abike Imedi, H.E. Hedgemon, Lamar Giles, Chloe Gong, Alexis Henderson, Tiffany D. Jackson, and many others. I picked up this proof copy, I think at a library book sale or a little free library, and because of all the various authors, I was really interested to read it. And this definitely does what it says on the tin. It is 13 scary stories of fear and power, and they all are written by people of color, and the vast majority of them are queer as well, which was really interesting and not something that I knew. It kind of has a framing narrative that these 13 stories, these 13 adventures, these 13 horror tales are 13 horror short films and were found after the 13 white stars of the films were found dead. So there's kind of like a beginning framing short story, and then you get into the individual stories. The individual stories don't really have a lot to do with each other other than they're all about people of color, they're all about teenagers or young adults. They all have a white guy who dies first. Some of them are really gory though. Some of them are really disgusting. A lot of them do not have happy endings. A lot of them are heroes, don't make it through to the end. A lot of them have to do with racism. A lot of them have to do with power imbalance. I thought they were really interesting. The stories that stand out to me stand out because they were so gory, because they were so gruesome, because they didn't have happy endings, but none of them stand out to me because they were like exceptionally written. That being said, I really did enjoy some of the stories and the writing in some of the stories, so I will definitely be revisiting these authors, and this is a really good way if you love horror and if you're okay reading YA to taste test authors. I don't read a lot of YA anymore, but I thought this was a good version of YA, and I enjoyed it. The next book that I finished in July is Jazz by Toni Morrison. This is the Bluest Eye, Sula, Song of Solomon, Tar Baby. This is the 6th book that Toni Morrison wrote in publication order, and I'm going through her work in publication order, so this was the next book that I had to read. This one takes place in Harlem. This is about Violet and Joe, who are a couple who grew up, met each other in the South, and then moved to Harlem to pursue more opportunity there, and it's about their life and their relationship. But when we first meet this couple, we find out that Joe has had an affair with a young woman who he has murdered, and then Violet tried to cut up the corpse at the funeral. That's like the first page. That's like the very beginning of this book. So a outrageous start, a intriguing start, a shocking and dramatic start to a book. It definitely leads you to want to know what the circumstances of this were and how this all happened and the relationship between Violet and Joe. And so we follow them, like with all Toni Morrison books, in and out of the current day, through the past, through their thoughts, through meeting other people. I think out of her books, this one probably most reminds me of The Bluest Eye in the way that it's told, because it is very like segmented and it does follow quite a lot of characters, and the characters that you end up following for a long time are not necessarily the characters that you thought you were going to follow. But all of her books kind of do that thing where they're like linear in the overarching story, but non-linear in the way that people's backgrounds and thoughts and life experience come into play. And through those backgrounds, life experience, and thoughts, we also meet other people. So we see what Violet's mother's life was like, and what her siblings were like, and what Joe's mother and parents and the whole community around these people are like. And it's just so good. And Toni Morrison is just so amazing. And her books are so incredible and so captivating and weirdly like homey and comfortable and comforting, even though their subject matter is, really rough a lot of the time. I thought this was fantastic. I loved it. This one's kind of a hard one to explain, and it also has a narrator who we don't fully know who it is. They are an omnipotent narrator, but they also are talking to you as if they're a character, which I thought was interesting. So I'm really intrigued to read on in her oeuvre and just see like how her writing progresses and how it changes. They're just so great. I mean, if you haven't read Toni Morrison, you absolutely need to. The next book that I finished in July is Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor. I found this at a used library sale earlier this year, and I was so excited to find it because I had really wanted to read it. This follows Manod, who is a young adult, like new adult in her 20s, somewhere living on a very remote island in Wales. This takes place in the early 20th century. We get to learn through kind of short chapters and little vignettes about her life on the island, about her father, who is a lobster fisherman, about how this island is behind the times in their dress, in their community, in their style, in everything that they do than the mainland, because it is so remote, because it is so removed from the mainland. And then two English men come, a woman and a man, who are researching this small community and the culture and the language on this community, and they take to Manod and they ask her to help them with translation, because Manod really wants to eventually leave the island. She really wants to try to become more educated about the rest of the world and about life, and she has learned English and she's trying to teach her sister English, so they ask her to translate things, and their kind of relationship grows from there. But there is very obviously like a power imbalance there, and the English people tend to discount the island people's reality because it is so dissimilar to their own. And this story is kind of all revolving around a whale washing up on the island, a dead whale, and how the islanders think that this is a bad omen, and how they link this dead whale and its decay and its demise to various things that also happen on the island. At the same time, we're getting snippets of transcription that the English people are taking. Specifically, the woman is talking to everyone and recording everything. They're writing everything down, and we learn further about the relationships on the island, and then how those relationships are changed when people start forming relationships to these two English people. This one was interesting, but it was very, very similar to The Colony by Maggie, what was her name? Agee. That took place in Ireland during the Troubles. It was a very similar plot. It was a very similar premise. It also reminded me a lot of Clear by Karis Davies. That was my favorite out of the three of these books. That one has a very different take on that very similar thing. Clear also takes place in Wales, like Whale Fall. Oh, Whale Fall, I just got that. Whale Fall. Interesting. So I would say that if you want to read one of those stories, I would read one of the other ones. I would read Clear and The Colony over Whale Fall. I didn't think that this was doing anything totally amazing. I don't think it had any revelations that those books didn't have. It just wasn't my favorite, unfortunately. It was fine and I enjoyed it while reading it, but the similarities to those other books was too stark, too obvious, and I just preferred those other books over this one. The next book that I finished in July, Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shauna McGuire. This is a reread for me. This is a signed copy that I got at a used book sale. I wanted to continue on with this series, and I haven't read any of the books physically, so when I got this copy a few years ago, I always intended to reread it physically, and I'm so glad that I did. Down Among the Sticks and Bones is the second in the Wayward Children series. The Wayward Children series follows children who have gone through doors, who have gone through portals to portal worlds that are better than our world. Just like Alice in Wonderland, just like Narnia, just like those old tales, kids fall through portals and go to worlds that are better suited to them. Now, are those worlds always safe? Are those worlds always good? No. And a lot of times they're not able to stay in those worlds, and that's what happens to Jack and Jill, twins that fall through a trunk in their attic to the moors. The moors is their world. The moors is where they want to be, but it is not always a safe place. It is not always the best place for them, and they are eventually kicked out and have to go to Eleanor West's School for Wayward Children, which we learn about in the first book, Every Heart a Doorway. This series follows the pattern of one book being a quest book, a book of adventure like the first one was, and the next book being a book describing in more detail what happened in the actual worlds that these kids went to. So in the first book we have a quest, we meet Jack and Jill. In the second book we see their world and what happens to them there and why they're back at Eleanor West's school in the first book. Super happy to have revisited. I plan on continuing on with the rest of the series. If you like fantasy, if you like portal books, if you like representation, if you like queerness, if you like whimsical fairy tale-esque stories that are unique and engaging and sad and funny and sweet, I definitely highly recommend this series. The next book that I finished in July was The Healing Season of Pottery by Yoon Somin, translated by Claire Richards. This is a Korean book, and it kind of follows the Korean Japanese trend of books that like are self-help books disguised as little novels. So think Days at the Murakami Bookshop, think Before the Coffee Gets Cold. This book is very similar in that every character and story in this book, every kind of avenue of plot in this book is also a self-help, idealized, idealistic way of life. Our main character, Jung Min, has quit her job as a journalist and as a writer for TV and journalistic TV shows because she's kind of fallen out of love of writing. She always wanted to be a novelist, but she got into this screenwriting job and she was trying to do good with it, but she finds that her screenwriting and her producing of these shows is kind of getting twisted around. So she's in a deep depression. She lives on her own in this really cute, quaint little like apartment complex slash neighborhood. But now she's super depressed and she's just staying home all the time. So she finally decides that she has to get up and she has to go out. She stumbles upon what she thinks is a coffee shop. So she goes in. She's not really dressed for the weather. She goes in and she discovers that it's actually a pottery studio. They give her coffee and they encourage her to come back and join the pottery studio, which she does. And then the rest of this book is Jungmin learning about all the different people in the pottery studio and us as the reader learning about them, their lives, their stories, their morals, their advice that they have to give to people to better their lives or take the advice of their life story to better your life. This one had a little bit more of a plot to it because we learn about Jungmin's history and we learn about her life and her experience, and then we also see her meeting someone who she finds attractive, and maybe there's a little bit of a love story there as well. It was okay. It was fine. It was fun. I read this book on audio. I enjoyed it. This had a similar thing to the Clockhouse Murders that because I read it on audio, I wasn't always looking at the physical copy. I had trouble sometimes distinguishing the different characters' names and who was who. I think if I had read it physically, I would have had an easier time of it. I love this cover. It's so pretty. I love the cat on it. It does have a cat character, and that is important, which is nice. There were definitely a couple moments where I like teared up in this. I like these kinds of books if they're done well. I think my favorite one so far has been The Full Moon Cafe. I thought this one was fine. I just thought it was too long and I thought it was a little bit too drawn out. But if you're interested in those kind of books, it was a fun read. The next book that I finished in July was The Hole by Hiroko Yamamata. This was translated from the Japanese by David Boyd. This is a very thin, very slim little novella. It's very weird. It's follows Asa, who has a part-time job, but her husband works as like an office businessman, and his job changes. They live in the city and they are going to have to move out to the countryside to be closer to his job. They talk to his family who live out there, and it turns out that they have a house that they can stay in. So Asa's super excited. She's like down with not having to work, not having to pay rent, being able to stay by her in-laws. She doesn't really know much about her in-laws. She doesn't really know much about living in the countryside, but she's a very passive character. She's very much a person that life just kind of happens to. She doesn't really even know that much about her husband and what he does, but she's happy to go out there and just form a new life. So that's what she does. She's in the house by herself all day long, you know, trying to do things, trying to fix it up, but her mother-in-law works and her father-in-law works all the time, so she is alone a lot of the times. And then one day, her mother-in-law asks her to go to the local 7-Eleven, the local convenience store, and on her way, she sees a creature that she doesn't know what it is. Now, she's not used to the countryside, she's not used to this life, so she follows it to see if she can figure out what kind of animal this is, and she falls into a hole. And that's like the basic story on the back. That's like what they tell you about this book, and it's less about the hole than I would have thought, and less about holes in general than I would have thought, but it was a very interesting, very weird, very cerebral and nebulous story about Asa and Asa's life and this countryside living, the idea of identity, the idea of do you ever really know people, the idea of how people present themselves versus how they are, and all sorts of other things, and I really, really loved it. I thought it was very strange and very fun and definitely worth the read. The last book that I read in July was Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones. This is the third Tayari Jones I've read. I also read a short story, and I read An American Marriage. This follows two young girls, and we get the perspectives of them in big chunks. So the first one is Dana Lynn Yarborough, and Dana lives with her mother, and her father only comes to see them occasionally because Dana learns early on in her life that she is part of her father's secret family. So her father is married with another child, but loves her mother and comes to them, provides for them partly. Her mother also provides for them, but Dana grows up not being able to tell this secret of being the secret family. She has to grow up only getting certain parts, certain aspects of her father. She has to grow up knowing that he has a whole other family and that she can't talk about it to anyone and that she can't be involved in that other family. So she grows up trying to figure out why her father is like this and why her family is like this and how much she's really like loved in this family. And then the second part is the other sister is her father's other daughter, who is called Charisse. So then we see later, after Dana's story, Charisse's story and how Charisse finds out about this as well, which I don't think is a spoiler because I think it's told pretty early on in the book, you know, that they're both going to learn the truth of this father's secret lives. So I thought this was really interesting. This could have been a book that went really dark. This could have been a book that was really disturbing, but it wasn't, and I appreciated that. I don't want every story, especially every story I read about young black girls, to be sexually explicitly violent or just regular violent, and so I appreciated that. But there was a lot of trauma in this book, and there was a lot of negative things in this book, and it was interesting to see from these two girls' perspective and how they both dealt with this secret that their family was keeping. So I really, really enjoyed this one. I was pleasantly surprised by it. I don't think it's going to stick with me. Even American Marriage didn't stick with me that much, but I do really, really enjoy Tayari Jones's writing. I have at least one other of her books. If any of that sounded good to you, I would highly recommend. So those were the 18 books that I read in July. I had a really great reading month. It was a really long month in a lot of ways. I traveled and I did a lot of things and a lot of stuff happened in my life. Throughout it all, I managed to read quite a few books and some that are probably going to become new favorites. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!